and the budget and all sorts of serious stuff. But the Harry and Meghan interview, even though we haven't seen any more than a tiny couple of clips of it, absolutely obsessed the press this morning.
Yeah, and it's really interesting looking at the front pages, isn't it? How they're about half and half, whether their picture splashes the Queen or Meghan or Harry and Meghan. I don't know, if you read inside, it doesn't necessarily mean whether they're displaying their colours as being Team Sussex or Team Windsor, but it shows you just where the split is. And anybody who is not interested in this story and thinks they can ignore it, I think can probably take from this morning's papers that that's really not going to be possible. The Queen, we're told, will not be watching it, but if you look inside the Mail in their 11-page special, we're told she's going to get a breakfast briefing about it. Aides in Buckingham Palace will stay up through the night to watch the explosive interview, and aides will relay Harry and Meghan's comments over breakfast. And it also tells us CBS are charging £234,000 for a 30-second slot during the interview. So that shows you what the interest is like in America. And in The Observer, there's a really interesting piece, comment from Robert Lacey, who is talking about how people, if they are taking sides in this split, it tends to be generational. Under 40s are more likely to be on the Sussex side, over 40s possibly more sympathetic to Buckingham Palace. And he says it also shows the differences between America and Britain. It's extraordinary how Americans see this as a question of the Sussexes finding freedom, whereas here we tend to accept that you will be restricted if you're a member of the royal family. So that shows you some of what the divide of the audience is going to be watching that interview. It
is a huge divide, Martin Lewis. We almost need red roses and white roses to wear for the next day or two. Will you yourself, can I ask, be staying up to watch this great extravaganza?
Well, probably the ITV one on Monday. I'm not sure. For me, this is just rift as young couple not sure they want to follow in the family business, and I'm not sure that gets me that much. The question for me is this like a trail for a Hollywood film where we've basically seen the best bits already, and then when we watch the film, we'll go, oh, it was all in the trails, all the good stuff? Or is it a tease to the real salacious truth that's likely to come out? And I don't think we'll know until we've actually seen it, and I'm not sure I can be bothered investing the time in it, although I think my wife might draw me into watching it because I know she's keen.
We'll be very interested to see. Now then, you are much more excited by a front-page story on the Sunday Telegraph, which is right up your street because it's about coronavirus tests.
Yeah, we are obsessed in this household over coronavirus statistics, and obviously my daughter's 8, she's going back to school on tomorrow, as are many, many other children. And those in senior schools, there's 57 million lateral flow tests that will be done. Now, the lateral flow test, it's a bit controversial, and this is sort of drawing it. What we've heard before is there are many false negatives, so there will be children who have coronavirus going into school who have a negative test. But of course, even that, having lateral flow tests means some children who are positive will get a positive test on the lateral flow test and won't go into school. The concern here in the Telegraph is about false positives. So children who test positive when they aren't really positive. So the advice is that they should have a PCR test. And this is becoming the new division. I mean, interestingly, my wife works for the BBC. When she has to do a report, she has to have a lateral flow test to decide whether she's safe to go in. For my ITV show, the studio that we work for said they wouldn't accept lateral flow tests. So I have a PCR test each Wednesday, and then I sort of self-isolate until the Thursday show. So there is a big difference in attitude. And what the push here is, if a child tests positive on the lateral flow tests, which are substantially more inaccurate, they should then always be given a PCR test afterwards to see whether they go into school or not. But even then, some people who have had the positive lateral flow test and the negative PCR test are still being told they have to self-isolate. So I think some decision needs to be made on that gets it to be sorted out properly. It's
a great issue, and we'll be talking to Gavin Williamson and Susan Hopkins about it later in the show. Sarah Smith, first of all, the big story, I suppose, from the budget that the papers have picked up is this 1% NHS offer, which is causing a lot of anger among the RCN and other NHS unions.
Yes, it's on the front page of The Observer and carried in the other papers as well. So The Observer is predicting a backlash. It says ministers face a public backlash, but it's also talking about the possibility of a backbench backlash as well, saying that senior Tories are already predicting the government will be forced to rethink the offer. And The Observer have done a poll saying 72% of the public believe the pay deal should be more generous. And it's talking about private concerns that have been raised with the Treasury and people who believe the 1% pay offer will be revisited. And of course, like so many of the stories we talk about, it is all slightly different in Scotland. Nurses' pay deal will not be negotiated until the summer here. They've been given an interim 1% rise, and they did get a £500 bonus before Christmas. So yet one more England-only story there, but a big one that could have really big consequences for the government and the Chancellor's budget.
Well, let me talk about a UK-only story which started in Scotland but has gripped people, which is the Sturgeon interview, the Sturgeon evidence to the Scottish Parliament this week. 8 hours she sat there for, giving detailed answers. She couldn't remember everything, but it's an extraordinary bravura performance, which I can't imagine very many ministers down in London being able to cope with. Nevertheless, there's 2 polls this morning, aren't there, Sarah, showing that it has dented support for the SNP and for independence. We can put on the screen, I think, Scotland on Sunday. Support for Sturgeon ahead after Sturgeon's inquiry evidence. That doesn't make sense.
Support for union
ahead.
It
must be support for union ahead after Sturgeon's inquiry evidence. That's what it says. Sorry, Sarah, I beg your pardon. Just tell us what it was like. You had a ringside seat and a big bag of popcorn.
I certainly did, and it was 8 solid hours, 9 till 5, with just a couple of breaks. And she is a fantastic communicator. That is one of Nicola Sturgeon's great skills. And so she was across nearly all of the detail. She was calm and measured, except for when a couple of really quite emotional moments talking about the close friendship she had had with Alex Salmond, which is now obviously completely destroyed by this saga. And that was quite human when you saw her like that. And yeah, I mean, it reminded you that she is a world-class politician at communications and presenting herself, but so's he. I mean, his evidence that he gave about 5 days before, last Friday, he was also extremely solid on all of the detail, very measured, very calm, putting forward his case in a way that reminded you just why he had been such a successful politician in Scotland as well. They are well matched as 2 extremely accomplished performers, but the story is clearly cutting through. So there's a poll in the Sunday Times as well as the one on Scotland on Sunday, and they show very similar results, which is support for independence down a little and down below 50%. Remember, we had 22 polls in a row that suggested majority support for independence, and that's taken a dip just in the last week or so. Both polls show a substantial number of people saying they don't believe Sturgeon is telling the whole truth. Some people saying they think she should resign. And the key thing in all of this is, what is it going to do for the vote in the Holyrood elections? Because remember, this astonishing drama is happening just weeks away from elections at the beginning of May.
Absolutely.
So the polls today suggest SNP might just win them, squeak them with a majority of 1 seat. Is that going to be enough to really allow them to press on for a second referendum on independence?
Very, very interesting indeed, Sarah. Thanks so much. Let's turn back to the budget, however, Martin, because looking across the papers, there's surprisingly little detailed coverage of such an important budget.
Yeah, it's exactly why I dressed my set today, putting all the papers there. It's really interesting for me. Normally each year the budgets actually aren't that big as a money-saving expert, because they're about macroeconomic policy and the state of the economy in its totality, and it's for economists. This year was different. This year was a big personal finance budget. But what was interesting, for the first time, the Chancellor did a press conference, and I sat there because I had an interview Thursday morning with the Chancellor, a 15-minute one for my show on the Thursday evening, sitting there, and you sort of, as a journalist, you're going, are they going to ask the same questions as me? Do I have to rethink what I'm going to do because that issue's already out there? And one after another, none of the questions I was planning to ask were asked in the press conference, because the people who were sent to that were economics and sometimes business correspondents rather than personal finance. And for me, I think only 50% of this budget has actually been covered on much broadcast news, if I'm honest, and in print news. Big stories out there that we've not seen.
Just give us a couple of examples, Martin, of what we've missed in that case.
Well, the excluded group is one of the biggest stories in the nation right now. If you ask me to glibly sum up this year's budget, it would be those people who've been helped will continue to be helped, those people who haven't will continue not to be helped. And the excluded group is up to 3.8 million people who've not had any of the main support packages, furlough or the self-employment grants. I've been campaigning for one group of those, new starters, and they have been helped in this budget. 2019-20 tax returns will now be included in the assessment of whether you get self-employment grants, and that should bring 600,000 people in. But a huge category of people who have had no specific help are those limited company directors, and almost, they're not technically sole traders, but one-person bands, if you like. And they've been lobbying for a long time. There's been support schemes proposed by the Federation of Small Business. There's been lots of meetings with the Chancellor, and this was the make or break. Would anything in this budget help that over 1 million people who are desperate? Some talk about taking their own lives on the back of not being able to support their families. And the answer was no. And when I interviewed the Chancellor on Thursday about this, and I pushed as to why not, but he wasn't going anywhere. My final question is, should we close the door? Are we telling limited company directors no help is coming for them? And he said yes. And that story's been missed, and it's so important to many people's lives. I'll give you another one. The universal credit uplift, the £20 a week, has been extended to October. Rightly, very important. They've also looked at one legacy benefit, which is working tax credit. That will have a £500 one-off payment being made in April, which sort of is the equivalent to the universal credit uplift. But there are many other legacy benefits, because remember, we're moving people from old-style benefits onto universal credit. And there are many people on those old benefits who aren't getting that uplift.
A lot of disabled people.
Disabled people and carers. Yes. And I pushed the Chancellor on this too, and he effectively said to me, this is targeted at working people, helping working people through the pandemic. Now, I tell you, if you had a mailbag like mine and you saw all the people with disabilities and carers and other people on legacy benefits who are having massively increased costs due to the pandemic that they're not able to support out, there are a lot of upset people. And the phrase the Chancellor keeps using is, we're helping we'll do everything we can to help people and businesses. And that sticks in the craw of those who are excluded from the help. But that's missed from these papers, at the front pages at least.
Martin, sometimes the most important part of my job is keeping my gob shut when I've got somebody eloquent with something to say. With you and with Sarah this morning, I've been in that position. Thank you both very much indeed. Now then, to the weather. Daffodils erupting all over the place, the spring is sprung, the grass is riz, all of that, but it has been pretty brutally cold as well. Dryish but bitter. We would like a little warmth, please. Sarah Keith-Lucas, who is, of course, in the weather studio. Sarah.
Well, Andrew, I can't promise you too much warmth in the week ahead, but what I can promise you is that things are going to change, turning certainly more unsettled. So, yes, that will bring temperatures up a little bit, but it will bring some wet and windy weather into next week. But for today, well, here's the satellite image. You can see a bit of clear sky breaking through Lincolnshire, for instance, towards Dumfries and Galloway, southwest of England seeing a bit of sunshine too. But for most places, there's a fair amount of cloud out there today. Some outbreaks of rain across parts of northern Scotland, pushing towards Aberdeenshire at times too, and late in the day, some of that will push in across Northern Ireland, where temperatures are up to about 10 degrees. But for England and Wales, we're stuck at around about 7 or 8 degrees. But a lot of dry weather, light winds as well, so some fairly decent weather out there through the rest of today. Now into this evening and tonight, that cloud in the north sinks a little bit further south, so patchy outbreaks of rain across the northern half of the UK. Further south, it's looking clear and also dry, so temperatures getting down below freezing. Touch of frost Monday morning in the south. But Monday looks like a largely dry day with some sunshine for parts of Wales, southern England too. Cloudier for northern England, Northern Ireland and for southern Scotland with some light outbreaks of patchy rain. So temperatures up to around about 9 or 10 degrees, a little bit milder than they have been through the course of the weekend. But next week, do be prepared. There could be some wet and some windy weather through the middle of the week.
I didn't enjoy the very last bit of that. Now then, Labour was this week very quick to criticise the government for offering a pay increase of 1% to NHS workers in England. So what should they be paid? Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Health Secretary, is with me. Before we come to the nurses, let's talk about tomorrow. Schools are going back. Given what Labour has said, are you absolutely sure they're safe?
Yes, schools should return. I mean, of course, they've been open for children of key workers, and we shouldn't forget that. But it's important that children are back in school. I think it was the Royal College of Paediatrics who said when you close schools, you close children's lives. So we do need to get all our children back in school, but we need to make sure that our schools have the ventilation in place, that they have the classrooms set up in a way in which children can be spread out. We suggested to the government they set up Nightingale classrooms, if you like. They didn't do that, but it's important that children do go back to school.
You also suggested to the government that teachers must be vaccinated before schools reopen, and that is not happening, but you still think they're safe?
I think it's disappointing that teachers were not carved out for vaccination, because the key thing about teacher vaccination was that it wasn't dependent on schools reopening that they were vaccinated. But our concern is that children will be sent home again because staff will be off sick because they haven't been vaccinated, causing further disruption to children's education. So that was the point about teacher vaccination. Joe Biden's actually doing it in America. So other countries are putting that teacher vaccination as making it a priority. We didn't, but we still think schools have to open. It's important for our children.
Let's talk about something that's not unlikely, which is that schools reopen, and as a result of that, in part, the R number goes again above 1. But because so much of the country is now vaccinated, that doesn't translate into more hospitalisations and more deaths. In that situation, where we've got a spike in cases, do you think schools should stay open?
Well, this is why you have to put in place other mitigating measures across society. So if schools reopening puts that upward pressure on the R, which lots of epidemiologists are expecting, we need to make sure that we're taking other measures or implementing other measures in society, which is why we have to be cautious on the reopening of hospitality, on pubs and restaurants. I would not rush in to opening up other sectors of society until we've really assessed the impacts of schools reopening. But schools reopening for all children has to be a national priority.
So to be clear, to get that national priority established, you'd be prepared to slow down the current roadmap for reopening elsewhere?
Yeah, because you have to be driven by data, not arbitrary dates.
Yeah.
And I think if you're going to ask me, what is my priority? It's children in school rather than pubs and restaurants being reopened. But of course those businesses have to be compensated. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't get recompense for staying closed, but my priority will always be children's education.
There's been an awful lot of talk about the attainment gap and the problems suffered particularly by kids from lower income families. Do you think that, for instance, the school day should be extended to help them?
I think we've got to look at a whole range of interventions.
Such as?
Well, I mean, you've got to look at the school day, you've got to look at summer activities. You've got to do this in partnership with teachers, because teachers have been working incredibly hard. They've not had time off, and actually doing lessons via Zoom and sending work home and trying to mark it through and send it home. We've got lots of examples of poorer children who don't have access to laptops. They are digitally excluded. The schools have been taking work directly to those houses, posting the work through their letterboxes. So teachers have been working really, really hard. But you could do things across the summer. We could use our theatres. We could use our sports centres. We could use our dance studios. Lots of community facilities could be mobilised for summer activities for children.
So you've said that the restrictions could go on for a bit longer, furlough could go on for a bit longer. Let me talk about another area.
Because of data.
Yeah.
Because of data.
Another area where you may want to spend more money, which is in the NHS settlement. How much do you think that the nurses and other NHS workers should be getting?
Well, first of all,
RCN says 12.5%. What do you say?
Well, first of all, it was absolutely disgusting that the Tory government unveiled a budget which is putting tax up for hard-working families and cutting pay for nurses. And Rishi Sunak sneaked it out the day after because he was too cowardly to announce it on the day, even though he told us he was going to be honest. So
second of all, what's your answer? What's your answer to how much they should get?
This document is the NHS long-term spending plan.
Well, I promised. From here.
No, I know you can't. But it promised a 2.1% increase for NHS staff. Not only was it promised, it was budgeted for, and it was legislated upon. This is the law of the land. Tory MPs voted for 2.1%. That's a document. You can ask Gavin Williamson about it if you like. I'll give you that. You can see if you...
So that's really interesting.
So that is the basis.
Just wait a second. You say 2.1%. The RCN says 12.5%. There's a big gap there.
No, let me finish. So the government budgeted 2.1%. And they passed that in legislation because the spending plans for the NHS came to the House of Commons and it went through the House of Commons. Every Tory MP voted for 2.1% in January last year. That should be the basis on which negotiations and discussions are now entered into with the trade unions. But the independent pay review body will look at the submission from the RCN. It will look at the submission from Unison, which is the biggest trade union in the country, who are calling for a £2,000 uplift for every member of staff. It will look at the submission from the GMB, who are talking about ensuring that none of the poorer paid staff in the NHS receive less than the living wage.
Inquiry, but let me just ask about your belief.
Your belief, independent process.
This is a huge amount of money we're talking about. To be fair to the government, they didn't know there was a pandemic at that point. So when they put the 2.1%,
but they did say they would. They did say they would pay for all COVID costs. Rishi Sunak stood up and said the NHS will get all money it needs for COVID. They're now asking NHS staff to take a pay cut to pay for the COVID pressures. That is unfair.
They are. All I want to know is what is the Labour Party's view of how much nurses should get?
The Labour Party's view is that the staff groups are putting... You have a process, Andrew. You look at retention issues, you look at recruitment issues.
But then you have to take a decision.
And then you give it to the independent pay review body who will negotiate with the different trade unions, and then we will honour what that pay review body recommends. The government are not saying they will honour
whatever it says, you'll honour it.
Yes, but that's important because it's an independent process.
Let's ask you about something else where I might get a clearer answer.
But it is a clear answer because it's an independent process.
The RCN is now raising money for a strike. Would you support a nurse? They don't want to go on strike. No, they feel they may have to. I'm asking you, would you support a strike of nurses or not?
I know nurses. They don't want to go on strike. And I'll always champion nurses, and I'll always stand by nurses. But they don't want to go. They don't want to go on strike, and it's actually their right. It's their right to pursue industrial action.
Would you back them?
Well, you're giving me a hypothetical because they've not put out an industrial. They've not put out for a ballot.
John McDonnell said yes, of course.
I will always support our nurses. I will always stand by their nurses, and I will always support the rights of staff to take industrial action.
You would stand on a picket line alongside nurses on strike, or not?
We don't want to get to that place.
I know you don't
want
to get there.
So the government have to drop this 1% pay rise, which is a pay cut, because nurses don't want it. I talk to nurses all the time. They don't want to go on strike, and I'll always stand by them.
I'm sure they don't want to go on strike. They may conceivably vote for a strike nonetheless. John McDonnell said yes, of course he'd be he'd be on a picket line. Will you? Would you in those circumstances?
I've always supported the right for people to take industrial action, and I've always appeared on picket lines of NHS staff. But nurses don't want to go on strike. NHS staff don't want to go on strike. What they want to do is to have the pay and the resources to deliver the quality care that they want to deliver. The pay that they promised, 2.1%, which Tory MPs voted for in January 2019. January 2020, I beg your pardon.
I'm absolutely clear that you think nurses do not want to go on strike, and you may very well be right. I'm less clear what would happen if they did, whether Jonathan Ashworth would be standing alongside them or not.
Look, nurses don't want to go on strike. NHS staff don't want to go on strike. The government's responsibility is to implement the recommendations of the independent pay review body to avoid that disruption. But I've always supported NHS staff when they've decided to take action, because that is the right thing to do as a Labour Shadow Health Secretary.
Okay.
But we need to get to a situation where we avoid that.
Okay, let's turn to another area, which is the tax freeze. Labour supported the tax freeze on low-paid workers when it was proposed and said so. Annalise Dodd said so on this programme. Jeremy Corbyn said, no, it's the wrong thing to do, and you have now U-turned. Why?
We haven't U-turned.
Yes, you did. You supported the tax freeze. Now you don't support the tax freeze.
We said throughout this that this is not the time to be raising tax on hard-working families. And when you step back and look at the politics of this budget, what people have got to realise is that it's quite a political budget, but Rishi Sunak is actually putting up tax on hard-working families. The idea that the Tory party is a low-tax party is now for the birds. This is a high-taxing party putting up tax on hard-working families when we're not even out of a pandemic, when we're still in the midst of a crisis, and they're asking low-paid people to pay more in tax. That's the position of the Tory party
You've just said we didn't do a U-turn. We didn't do a U-turn on this. Annalise Dodds on the Today programme on Thursday. In principle, we are not against the freeze. Jeremy Corbyn in the Commons on public sector pay. Many are going to be hit through the freezing of the tax allowance. John McDonnell is a stealth tax. And now you say you are going to vote against it. Look, that is a change.
I'm not against a fairer tax system for high-salaried people. You know, the better off, those with the broadest shoulders should pay more tax. But we're not in favour of tax rises for lower and middle-income families. And that is what Rishi Sunak is introducing, a tax rise on hard-working families and cutting the pay of NHS staff. We're not in favour of that. We're in favour of supporting hard-working families.
All right, Jonathan Ashworth, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking to us. Now then, Susan Hopkins, Dr Susan Hopkins, is Deputy Director of Public Health England. She advises the government on its COVID policy, and she's an expert on the new variants of the virus that have emerged. I spoke to her just before we came on air, and I asked her, with the R rate currently under 1, will opening schools push it above 1 and therefore mean the pandemic is growing?
So I think we'll need to watch and wait and look carefully. That's why we're doing so much testing to the children on return to school and their families, to try and find those cases that may have asymptomatic infection and reduce the risk of transmissions in and around the school environment, and therefore keep R at the lowest level possible.
If it does go above 1, we see a spike in transmission. At that point, do you think we should pause children going back to school?
I don't think we should pause children going back to school. We've got 3 weeks before the Easter holidays. I think we will have time to look at the data very carefully over that period, and also then the data in the Easter holidays to see how things are responding. One of the tests that the government have looked at is the relationship between hospitalisations and deaths. And that is going to change in this next phase, because traditionally we knew the amount of cases in community directly related to the number of hospitalisations and deaths that we would see in future weeks. However, with the impact of vaccination, that has changed. It's one of the reasons why we need the 5 weeks of time between each of the opening, so that we can assess whether the rise in cases in community transfers into increased hospitalisations or not. We expect that relationship to diverge because as more and more of the population get vaccinated, especially those that would be likely to need hospitalisation, then we will be able to accept some cases in the community without needing further restrictions.
So does this mean, to be clear, that we are, as it were, tiptoeing into a new world where we cease to obsess endlessly about the R number? We've talked about little else for 6 months now, but the R number becomes less important because it does not necessarily lead to hospitalisations and deaths. We learn, in a sense, to live with it.
So that's clearly what we hope. We would like the R number to stay under 1 or as close to 1 as possible, because that will mean that we have the least amount of impact on our population. But we also know that vaccination is our way out of where we are right now, and it's our way of helping us to live with this by reducing the impact of this virus on individuals who have disease.
Well, let's keep focusing on schools, because kids are going back tomorrow, and lots of children will be very happy to go into class wearing masks, and quite a lot will not be. Now, given that we don't know very much about the transmission inside classrooms, but we do know that teachers, for instance, are no more likely to be hospitalised or die with COVID than anybody else, why are masks so necessary for kids?
So in secondary schools, from last September, we recommended they wore them in the communal areas. What we saw in late November, early December was rapid rises, particularly in secondary school age children, and that was associated with the variant that emerged in Kent, B117. What we know is that variant is more transmissible. We don't know how it transmits more effectively, but it does. And therefore, we are using everything we can at our disposal, both mask wearing in secondary school age children, mask wearing for teachers, as well as regular tests to provide every level of protection to reduce the risks of transmission and prevent rises in cases as schools go back. We will keep this under review as we do everything, and we'll monitor the impact on the children, the impact on schools, and also look and see how the case numbers go in the number of weeks going ahead, and decide what the future guidelines should look like.
Now, you mentioned tests just now. These lateral flow tests are, first of all, not hugely accurate, and secondly, they're quite intrusive and even slightly unpleasant to do. And the plan requires families and children going forward to do them twice a week at home. And I just put it to you that it is unrealistic to expect everybody to do that. And quite a lot of people will not do it. And this system may not be nearly as robust as it needs to be.
So I think that it's particularly important that everyone does the tests in the next few weeks. We still have a high prevalence in the population, just over 1 in 200 people positivity on PCR testing at the moment. We know that the lateral flow tests find the people who are the most infectious and therefore the most likely to transmit to others. We know that using these tests is a way of finding those asymptomatic people rapidly in the population as the result comes back in 30 minutes. And yes, it is uncomfortable, but I think it's within the secondary school age children, it's possible. My own 12-year-old has done it a number of times, either through studies or through testing for symptoms like every other parent has. And I think it's really important that we use everything at our disposal as we go back to school. They will be done in the school environment for the first couple of weeks, for the first 3 tests, And the reason for that is to have supervised, trained individuals, ensuring that the tests are done properly and ensuring that they're read properly and providing support to the children as needed.
But going further forward, these lateral flow tests have quite a large number of false positives. And if you do the numbers across the country, an awful lot of families are going to be required to self-isolate, not have an income coming in many cases, because of tests they can't entirely trust. Normally, in other parts of the economy, people are then given PCR tests to double check. That's not happening with school children and their families. Why not?
So if you get a test at the asymptomatic testing sites, which is how the schools are being set up at the moment, we don't require confirmatory PCR because it's being done in a specialised environment and individuals who are trained to deliver it. And, if there's any concern about how the test has been performed or the accuracy of it, it can be repeated there and then. Where we recommend people do PCRs if they test at home, and that's for the families, for example, who in primary school children who will be testing themselves at home rather than in school. And also when the children start to test themselves at home, we would be recommending confirmatory PCR tests for those individuals then. However, moving into the school environment, it's important that we test children back into school and, allow them in safely because we're still at a high prevalence level.
I'm sorry to jump in, but if I have a school-aged child and the child tests positive on a lateral flow test, is it the case that I can then get a PCR test to avoid the entire family self-isolating or not?
So we are not recommending that for the next 2 weeks because we want to find the children who are positive on these tests and to prevent the transmissions that could occur in schools. We've looked very carefully at the evidence that's emerging from the tests that have been delivered at home and in the testing sites over the last 8 weeks. And the actual validation of those tests in real life scenarios suggests that it's 99.9% at least is specific, which means that the risk of false positives is extremely low, less than 1 in 1,000. And we would expect that would be the same risk with PCR tests. No test is perfect. And a test that reveals only less than 1 in 1,000 false positives is a very good test.
We talked a little moment ago about the prevalence of the virus in the community at the moment. What we do know, Ian Diamond has said that, we're not out of the woods yet. And we do know that there are parts of England, in particular parts of the northeast and the northwest, where we are seeing numbers rising again. Why do you think that is? Could it be a new variant there as well?
So we're actually increasing the number of whole genome sequencing across the country and being able to monitor the variants that are in circulation and are circulating very carefully. In an area that we're seeing rising numbers of cases, we increase the sequencing for the cases that happen there. And we haven't seen a new variant emerge in the same way as we've seen it for in B117. And we're much more prepared than we were at that point. So we are looking very carefully. We see that areas that have enduring transmission, ongoing numbers of cases, are often in areas where a large number of people need to go out to work and are not able to work from home. And that is clearly associated with more contact with other individuals. So what we are doing there is trying to, again, increase the number of asymptomatic testing with small businesses being able to access testing for their staff at asymptomatic testing sites and even sign up to be able to deliver that in work. And I think that's going to be the really important thing for us to do in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Find all of those cases that are asymptomatic, increase the availability of testing for small businesses so that they can ensure their employees are safe, and also work with local authorities to make sure that people can isolate effectively and safely and are supported to do so.
There's been a lot of publicity about the new Brazilian variant, and we heard 3 cases being found in Scotland and 3 cases in England, now all traced. Do we know of any other cases?
So we're constantly looking at the whole genome sequencing. We have no more new cases to report today, but we'll continue to report the news on any new cases as it emerges and as we understand the data.
Now, we know that it takes 2 weeks for the results to come through on testing for these new variants, so we could be 2 weeks behind at the moment. And we remember very vividly back around Christmas when that moment of unlocking, and that was when the Kent variant suddenly rushed around the country. Is it possible that we will see the same thing happening now?
So, firstly, I think the B117, the Kent variant, is very transmissible and is highly unlikely that another variant is going to be more transmissible than that as we unlock. I think our concerns relate to the fact that we know that the vaccine is extremely effective against the B117, and therefore it is likely to drive down cases of it. And so as it drives down cases of it, other cases that may be less responsive to vaccine, we're still waiting for this formal studies on that, may be able to climb and rise faster than B117. I think we're in a good position to be able to track these variants, better position than any other country globally. And I'm really proud of the researchers and scientists led by Sharon Peacock with COG UK, who set up this research service that we're now transitioning into a public health service. I think we're in a good position to be able to track this. I don't think it's going to change our outcome now, but it is something we're going to need to watch really carefully over the weeks and months to come.
Well, you mentioned Sharon Peacock just now. She thinks that the new variants will not impact or prevent our unlocking programme. Do you agree with that?
I sincerely hope so. I think that we need to watch the data and the evidence. I think it won't change us for the next 3 to 5 weeks. I think that would be highly unlikely. I think we'll need to monitor it carefully over the summer months, as we will have the vast majority of our adult population vaccinated against the strains that are very effectively vaccinated against. We will need to monitor carefully as new strains come into the country from around the world. And we will need to be very ready for an autumn that could be challenging as these variants are there. We're working very closely with the vaccine manufacturers to see what they can do to develop new vaccines. But we're also very conscious of the fact that what happened last summer, in late summer and early September, could happen again. And we need to be prepared for that and hope that it doesn't happen.
Tell me a little bit more about problems in the autumn, because people will have noticed, for instance, that furlough carries on until September. And therefore there must be some anxiety that we will be back in a difficult situation by the autumn, September, October.
Well, I think it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future, and 6 months away is a long time. We've been working and understanding this virus for now 14 months. I think we have to prepare for a hard winter, not only with coronavirus, but we've had a year of almost no respiratory viruses of any other type. And that means potentially the population immunity to that is less. And so we could see surges in flu, we could see surges in other respiratory viruses and other respiratory pathogens. And so that it's really important that we're prepared from the NHS point of view, from public health and contact tracing, that we have everything ready to prepare for a difficult autumn. And we hope that it won't occur and that it will be a normal winter for all of us.
Some people will be watching this, Susan Hopkins, and be saying, Susan Hopkins, for goodness sake, literally give us a break. They'll be thinking about their summer holidays. What's your view about that?
So I'd like a break too, and we'd all like a summer holiday. And I think that we will hopefully all have our summer holidays. But my job is to advise the government and to prepare for worst case scenarios. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily happen, but my job is to make sure that we have options available for the country in case things are not as satisfactory as we'd all like them to be. Sadly, we have to make sure that we are prepared, and we're better prepared for this autumn than we have been previously.
Dr. Hopkins, it's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the first crucial step out of lockdown, schools reopen to all pupils in England tomorrow. Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales are to follow very soon. Secondary school children are being asked to wear masks and to test themselves at home. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, joins me now. Welcome, Mr. Williamson. As we begin this conversation, could we just remind ourselves of one of the really important moments during the pandemic? Here is the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak and others clapping for carers outside number 10. Did you clap?
Like everyone, the whole nation went out there to clap.
And do you think, therefore, that the whole nation agrees with the Royal College of Nursing that this 1% pay increase is frankly an insult?
Well, Andrew, what we have done is we set out one of the largest investment proposals for the NHS that we've seen in a generation. Just this year, an increase of £6 billion over the next few years. We're going to be seeing close to an extra £34 billion going into the NHS. We recognise the vital, important role that the NHS plays.
None of which helps, I'm sorry to interrupt, but none of that helps an exhausted, crying nurse. As Labour's Jonathan Ashworth just pointed out, Tory MPs voted through a 2.1% increase for nurses just before the pandemic, when they put themselves at risk and worked so hard. Do you think the nurses deserve more than 1%?
All we're having to deal with is an incredibly challenging economic situation where we've put forward a proposal, we've put forward what, Andrew, our focus is about making sure that we recover from this pandemic.
Sure. I'm sorry to interrupt. I will come on to that. But nonetheless, this award has caused a lot of anger up and down the country. And we all understand that from time to time, any government of whatever stripe makes a mistake. And the answer then is to acknowledge that and to change. Is this 1% immutable, absolutely carved in stone, or might you rethink it as a government?
Well, Andrew, we stated, and as has been stated just last week, this is very much part of the process, what the government has put forward as part of an independent review. That's what the government has set out as just last week. But we are continuing to invest in the NHS. This is why record amounts of money are going to the NHS. But we are dealing against a backdrop, a very difficult economic backdrop, where we've seen a 10% fall and we're seeing almost 750,000 people out of work. So, there's some significant challenges. But that was why we decided to exempt the NHS from the pay cap across the rest of the public sector, which is having a freeze. The NHS was exempted, and you're also seeing over 1 million people in the NHS getting a larger pay increase for the coming year on the back of some record increases in terms of nurses' pay as well as doctors' pay as well.
Well, the record increases amount to very little money when you look at it in detail. Nevertheless, can I ask you very, very straightforwardly, do you think nurses are wrong to see this 1% offer, after all they've been through, as an insult?
Nurses have been doing, the whole NHS, but also right across society, have been doing an amazing job and putting themselves to going to enormous lengths in order to be able to help us beat this pandemic. And we're incredibly grateful for that work. But this is why we're backing it up with the investment that we're putting in place on the NHS, supporting not just those nurses, but the doctors, but the whole system in order to be able to recover. But, I very much look forward to sort of seeing that continued investment flow into the NHS. That's the Prime Minister's commitment. That's the Health Secretary's commitment. The whole government's commitment to deliver on that.
Are all schools in England going to open tomorrow?
Yes, we're seeing a full reopening of schools. As you can imagine, Andrew, there's over 20,000 schools right across the land, so it's a massive logistical exercise. It's certainly not for the faint-hearted, but equally, as you have the opportunities, I'm sure you do and I have done, sort of go out speaking to parents, children and also teachers, how keen they are to be able to either be returning to school or to be welcoming children back into school. So this is our first step, our real first step in terms of moving out of national lockdown, and it's our schools that are leading the way. We always said that education was our national priority. It's the thing that we held most dear, and they would be the last things to close and they would be the first things to open, and that's what we said and that's what we're delivering on.
Susan Hopkins said a little while ago that opening schools could push the R rate above 1. If that happens, if we see a surge in infections, do schools stay open come what may?
Well, Andrew, we saw what the Prime Minister set out as part of a roadmap, sort of 4 key tests, whether that is the
I'm just asking a direct question.
So we very much factoring into the fact as part of a roadmap that actually schools will be staying open. This is why we've taken a cautious approach, because we intend it to be an irreversible approach, that schools will continue to remain open. It's so important for children.
So the answer to my
for society.
The answer to my question is yes. Yes,
will be remaining open.
Susan Hopkins also said that she hoped, I mean, she's a public health professional, she's not a politician, she said she hoped that schools reopened after Easter. As the politician in charge, can you guarantee that they will reopen after the Easter holidays?
Yes, schools will be reopening after the Easter holidays. And what we've done is we put in a whole series of measures. And we saw from September to December how successful we were in terms of controlling the virus within schools. We only had 0.2% of pupils who contracted coronavirus. But that was a whole system of protective measures that we put in place. But we've not just stopped there. Listening to the best public health advice from Public Health England and the best scientific advice, we've gone further in that in terms of face masks, but also importantly testing as well, which is something that hasn't been done before, but is one of the largest testing regimes that we've seen in this country. And
I want to ask you directly about face masks and about testing. Clearly, you regard face masks as absolutely essential to this, and yet you're not making them compulsory. It's just advice. If I, perish the thought, had a stroppy 16-year-old who said, "Dad, I am not going back to school with a face mask on, they can stick it," and he's with a group of other people who arrive in school without face masks, can the head teacher then exclude them? What's the legal situation? It's only advice.
Well, Andrew, I couldn't ever imagine you having a stroppy 16-year-old. As someone who has a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, when you speak to them and speak to all children, they recognise that what we're asking them to do is about not just keeping them safe, but also their friends safe and their teachers safe, the whole school community safe, but also their families and the broader community as well. So we saw the wearing of masks in communal areas that wasn't compulsory but was strongly advised. We saw that between September and December, and it worked very, very well. We recognise we're asking people to go a little bit above and beyond, but it's just one of the many measures that we put in place to reduce infection, reduce transmission, reduce the chances of people getting COVID. It's just not one single thing. It's one of many things that schools are doing.
I'm just saying, given that it's a suggestion, as it were, not an instruction, that doesn't really help hard-pressed head teachers and teachers confronted with children who don't come in wearing masks and won't.
Well, Andrew, as I said, we saw the wearing of masks in communal areas that worked incredibly well between the September and December. We hope that this is a temporary measure as schools return, but then when we get to Easter, you'll have seen the rollout of so many more vaccines. You know, we're seeing the doubling of the number of vaccines that are coming in, being available to the NHS from 2 million to 4 million. And actually, you know, lockdown has been a measure of controlling this pandemic, but we're moving from lockdown to controlling this pandemic, not through lockdowns, but through vaccines and through testing, which means people will be able to do so much more.
Let me ask you more or less the same question about testing, because these lateral flow tests aren't hugely accurate. They're quite invasive, even unpleasant to do. And your system requires families and children going forward to test themselves twice at home every week. The Royal Statistical Society and others have suggested that people simply won't do it, and if they do, you may not get the accurate answers in the school. If it's so important, why don't you have this happening in schools with volunteers so we can be absolutely sure what's going on?
So, Andrew, we've already been rolling out testing over the last few weeks, and we've seen in education settings the highest take-up of testing either within the schools or within the home of any employment settings of anywhere around the country. So we're already doing it. We're seeing tests going out there. It is working. But it is just one of those extra layers of protection that we're offering there. And actually, young people really do take a very responsible approach. They recognise that by doing these tests that they are helping others and they are protecting their own family and they're protecting their own friends. And I think we've really got to give them some credit for what they're doing. And on visits that I've just had over the last week to schools, talking to children who have gone through that process, and you're right, it's you would rather people not be in a position to have to test, but they recognise it's a really important part of helping them get back into school at the earliest possible moment. And there's going to be literally millions more tests that are going to be rolled out across the country that would never have happened if we hadn't have had this programme. It's it's such an important part of what we're doing. And
let's talk about the challenge. Let's talk about the challenge going ahead. Let's talk about the challenge going ahead, because this is going to be an absolutely massive one, particularly in the so-called attainment gap between children from the poorer families and children from better off families. The Education Endowment Fund said back in the summer, just talking about the first lockdown, that school closures would widen the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers, reversing the progress made to the gap since 2011. So over 10 years, reversing 10 years of progress. And that's just the first lockdown, never mind the second one. This is a huge, huge challenge. Are you levelling with people about it?
Well, Andrew, you're right to highlight the enormous challenges here, and this is probably why this is why myself and so many other people came into politics, because actually what you want to do is you want to eradicate that attainment gap, and what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to look at transformative measures within our education system.
Which I'm going to come on to those. I'm going to
address some of those problems, and this is why we've already invested £1.7 billion in terms of actions such as targeted tutoring.
Gavin Williamson, I'm going to come on to those transformative measures in a moment, but just before I do, I'm aware that there are a lot of people watching television this morning and thinking to themselves, that Gavin Williamson, he's not quite the right man for this job. Are you sure that you are?
Well, Andrew, what my focus is always on is delivering the very best for children, whether that's extra resources going into school, but most importantly, making sure children are back into the classroom. So that's where I want to see my children. I think that's where most of your viewers want to. That's where my focus is. That's what we're going to be delivering next week. That's what we're going to be delivering tomorrow.
Let me remind people why I might just have said that, because people remember very vividly back around Christmas when you said schools were going to stay open and then a day later you closed them. They will remember the absolute exam chaos over the summer and the terrible scenes in British universities, and that all happened on your watch. And they perhaps think, when it comes to the big decisions, Gavin Williamson has not been taking the right decisions.
Well, Andrew, we've been dealing with a global pandemic, and we've had to deal with whether it's new variants emerging and other challenges sort of presenting itself. But at every stage, my focus has been doing what is right for children. So I'll be always the first one to want to see schools remain open. I'll always be the first one to want to see children in schools. And I will never make an apology for wanting to keep our schools open and children having the benefit of a brilliant education in front of their teacher. So that passion for education, passion for delivering for children is what drives me in this job, and what will be driving me to make sure that children are back in school tomorrow.
I wonder if you regret cancelling exams this year. We know that teachers are now going to set the grades, and experts on all sides suggest this will inevitably result in grade inflation because teachers know their children and their children's families and lean in that direction. And yet you have not put in place a robust system to combat that. Does that not mean that this exam system will be unlike any other and will not produce robust, fair and usable results?
Well, Andrew, the first approach to assessment would always be through exams. It's quite simply the best form of assessment that we can do. But when we're not in a position to be able to run exams, we do need to make sure that we have the very best alternatives. We work very widely, not just with teaching profession.
But you could have put in Ofsted inspectors and retired teachers to invigilate this and keep an eye on it, and you haven't done that.
But what we've done is we've made the decision to put our trust and confidence in teachers. All the teachers I speak to, as I'm sure the ones that you do, recognise how important this is to get right. This is why we've put, very clear guidance and structures around the awarding of grades. But on top of that, we're also putting a very, very sort of quality, very detailed quality assurance system, both internally within schools, but also an external quality assurance system that we're putting there with the exam board. So randomised sampling,
I'm going to ask you. I'm sorry, we're almost out of time here. I'm going to ask you, I'm afraid, for a one-word answer. Do you think we should extend the school day?
I think we should be evidence-based, and we're looking at that. We're looking at how the school year runs. We're looking at how we can boost teacher quality.
So the one word is perhaps. Gavin Williamson, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. That's all from me this morning. Thanks to all of my guests, and thanks, of course, to you for watching. I'll be back here next week at 9 o'clock when I'll be joined by Kelly MacDonald. She's the latest star to join the cast of everybody's favourite police drama, Line of Duty. But until then, Goodbye.